My name is Al Harvey. It is August 1, 2000, and we are in Memphis, Tennessee. Today I'm going to interview Judge Wyeth Chandler of Memphis, and this interview is part of the Legal History Project of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation. Judge Chandler, I want to begin this interview the way we begin depositions almost, by getting you to give us your full name and your date of birth.
Well, my full name is John Wyeth Chandler, and my date of birth was February the 21st, 1930, which makes me a little over 70 years of age.
Judge, I've had the opportunity to look at your biographical data that you provided to us, and it appears that you've been a United States Marine. You've been a lawyer in Memphis for 12 years, both as a partner in a law firm and as a solo practitioner. You were the mayor of Memphis for 11 years, re-elected twice. You were a judge of our circuit court at Memphis for 14 years and re-elected twice. And now in the last 5 years, you've been a very successful mediator and participant in alternate dispute resolution. You've accomplished a lot in your 70 years.
Well, I appreciate it. I've accomplished some things. All of those things were up and down. They weren't all perfect. My practice was most enjoyable. When I graduated from the University of Tennessee in 1955, I came to Memphis and went in practice with my father, who was, of course, Walter Chandler, who had been a congressman and been in the law practice since 1909. He was a UT graduate as well. As a matter of fact, my father and I and my son John were the first three in a row in a family to graduate from the UT Law School. So we have that to brag about.
Well, Judge, of all these accomplishments in the last 70 years or 50 years of professional life, who gets the credit?
Well, probably the main credit goes to my father and mother, who put up with me and allowed me to complete my education. I'm sure there were times when they thought that probably my career would be involved something in the neighborhood of Atlanta Penitentiary. But I was able to overcome it. As you know, I started school here as a youngster, and at 4 years of age, as a matter of fact, went to kindergarten and then into the public school system at Bruce and then Bellevue Junior High here in Memphis. And then went off to Castle Heights Military Academy. Again, I think they had a choice of the Tennessee Institute of where you send the baddos, and Castle Heights. Now, they told me in later years that they were just getting me ready for World War II. But the war ended when I was 15, so I couldn't do any damage at that time. But I enjoyed that education very much.
Did your parents send you to Castle Heights to straighten you out, or was this because you were a great student?
I think it was more of the first, but the good part about it was after my first year of getting used to it and really not being much of I ran more demerits, we'll say, than just about anybody in the school. But after that, I settled down. I had quite an athletic career up there and a scholastic career, and it was a great benefit, actually. It was the first real discipline I guess I'd ever had, and it was good for me. It made Marine boot camp just a laugh, really.
And I'm going to ask you about that, but I want to ask you first, before we get too far away from it, to tell us a little bit about your father.
Well, as I mentioned, Walter Chandler was a man who was the oldest son of 9 children. He was the oldest child of the 9. He was a very serious-minded person because even during his pre-teen years, he'd be the one to go down to the IC Railroad where his father worked as a mail clerk, and take his money packet and take enough out of it to pay the bills, the grocery and the rent and so forth, and then hand the rest of it over to his father because he was bad to drink. And that kind of got him in that early mode of very serious thinking. I never will forget one time when he told me that he had bought his cemetery plots, which he was buried in eventually, and my mother and many of his relatives, when he was something like 15 years old. He bought that 12-plot cemetery plot out at one of the local cemeteries, Forest Hills. He grew up, he went to, then moved from Jackson. They lived in Jackson originally. He moved to Memphis early in, or late in the 1800s. He went to school at the high school, which was Central now, but the high school, the only high school, public high school. He never graduated, I don't think. He tells me that he was sick during his senior year, and when they had graduation, he was well, so they just said, go ahead and get in line. And he then went to UT and went through undergraduate work and law school pretty much at the same time. And of course got a law degree in 1909 and returned here to practice. His practice was just beginning to go when World War I broke out. He went into the war. He was a captain in the field artillery. He was in every major battle in France. He was at Chateau Thierry. He was at Meuse-Argonne. He was everywhere. He came back, and if you recall, he was always known by a lot of lawyers and a lot of the people in this city as Captain Chandler, in remembrance of that time that he spent over in France. He met my mother, as a matter of fact, when he was taking his troops through Georgia on their way to New York to be shipped to France. She was there to serve sandwiches and cokes or whatever, the coffee and so forth, and she had run out. Well, he wouldn't put up with that, so he told her, well, you're going to take me to your house. He did, and they got him a bunch of neighbors, and they made him sandwiches for his whole company, and that started a romance. It took 7 years for him to finally get her to come down south. But as you know, he had a great career as a lawyer, and then, of course, as a city attorney, as a mayor. He was the mayor during the war, 40 to 46. He was also a congressman from 34 to 1940, wrote the Chandler Bankruptcy Act, which was, I guess, the bankruptcy law of the country for about 25 years.
Your father had the reputation, at least, of being a very high-minded and scholarly, and also a very sensitive individual. Is that would you agree with that?
I've never met any man in my life, and I say this honestly, that compared with him. He was the most honorable man I've ever known. As you know, he brought the Baker case. Baker versus Carr was his lawsuit. He was an astute lawyer, but he was so much more. He was, I'd pick up the paper and read that he was president of the Audubon Society, and he had asked people to throw their bread out and feed the birds during the snows. He was president of the Symphony League, the Opera League, this league and that league. He was involved in just about everything in this city. In fact, that's one of the things that I eventually want to point out, the difference between the involvement in many of the lawyers back in his day as compared to now, when it just seems like lawyers get so embroiled in their own practice that they just don't have the opportunity to be leaders in various activities in the city.
He was a good role model?
He was the best you could possibly have. Not that I ever lived up to his or filled his footprints, but he was the best man I ever knew.
Tell us about your mom.
Well, she was an Army brat. Her father was a colonel in the Army. She was born over here at the hospital in Hot Springs at the Army Hospital.
Her name was?
Her name was Dorothy Wyeth, and her father's name was John Wyeth, and I guess, of course, that's my name, John Wyeth. His name was John Churchill Wyeth, and he was the doctor at West Point for a number of years, and she grew up in her teenage years going to the prom and the dances and all with those the great World War II generals. They were all in Eisenhower and people like that. But she was a remarkable lady. She was taller than most people during that time. She's about 5'7". Carried herself erect and was every inch the Army brat. She was a fine lady.
She died early in life, Judge.
She did. She died, as a matter of fact, became ill while I was going through boot camp, and then later died that year. She got, somehow or another, got breast cancer. They removed both the breasts, and I thought they had it, and then it went into her lungs, and as a matter of fact, my father sent her down to Arizona. At that time, that was kind of supposed to be restful if you had lung cancer, at least help you feel better, not cure you. And I think the trip was overwhelming, and she died the next day. And it was one of the saddest things. The only time I ever saw my father really cry was when he brought her back here.
Did your father remarry?
Never thought about it. He had a lot of those, I call them the blue-haired ladies, chasing him all over town. He was been a real catch. He was a traveler. He went to Europe every other year, and he just, they were after him. He was a good man to get a hold of, but he never thought about anything of that type.
Do you have brothers and sisters?
I have one sister, Lucia. She's Lucia Outland. She married a doctor out in Collier, Pete Outland. He has a brother, as a matter of fact, still is a doctor out there. Pete died about 2 or 3 years ago with Alzheimer's. He took him a long time, and my sister hung in there and almost killed her. She's been a pride and joy to me all my life. She and I, in fact, we ate just not long ago, about 3 weeks ago. We went out to dinner, and my wife and I took her out to dinner, and it was wonderful.
Judge, I want to get back to your high school days at Castle Heights, and one of the reasons I want to go back there is because we know, for example, that you were a pretty good athlete and football player and other sports, and it was a little bit difficult, I guess, playing at Castle Heights because you were young going to high school, and you had a lot of postgraduate students there, didn't they?
We did. I was fortunate. I got involved with athletics up there first as a 10th grader. That's when I started, and I didn't have anybody to run the mile. Well, I had been, I could run around my block a lot of times back here, so I says, well, put me in there, and I did, and I ended up winning the Mid-South competition in the mile run, and that kind of at least gave me some notoriety. The next year I went out, thought I'll play a little football this year. I'd laid out a year. I'd played at Bellevue. And next thing I knew, the final game, I was starting at the end, and ended up next year played every minute of every game, offensively and defensively. If you remember, maybe some of my trouble during my life was caused by the fact that we never had any face masks. So we got hit pretty hard, and our helmets weren't too good either. They were kind of leatherish like the ones you see. And, right. But I boxed a little, I ran track. I didn't play any baseball or basketball, but I had a very fine time up there.
What about scholastics? Were you pretty good?
Well, they started off kind of mediocre, like most folks, I guess, that are taken out of Bellevue, and pretty lax attitude, and suddenly thrown into a deal where you got to go to bed every night at 9. Your big night is to go out and go to town till 10 o'clock on Friday, and look, you're 15, 16 years old, been carrying on pretty good. You don't know any women. It's a tough time for a youngster. But by the time I graduated, I think I was about 4th or 5th in the class, and brought myself up.
Have any special interest?
During that time,
Right.
my real class that I loved and still love was English. I had a great love of English, and we had some debating going on, and even reading the poetry. I'm a great lover of poetry, and Shakespeare and Dickens. Dickens is probably my favorite author.
I understand you can recite the story of Sam McGee at the drop of a hat.
No, it's not Sam McGee. Mine is The Face on the Ballroom Floor.
Is that right?
And The Raven. Those are my two favorites to pull out because everybody knows them. But I've enjoyed those kinds of recitations. I've written a few poems as well.
That's good. Judge, after Castle Heights, and you've told us you went up to the University of Tennessee, that would have been about what year?
Well, I went up there in the fall of 1947. I went up there, 3 of us from Memphis went out we got a chance to go out. We went out for football and got our brains beat out, and thought we'd try dating might be a better thing for us to do. But maybe George Sneed, I don't know whether you remember George Sneed, and a fellow named Hoot Gibson from CBC, and Sneed had gone to UT after going to Vanderbilt. In fact, he was always the one that could decide whether Vanderbilt was harder than Tennessee. And he said he made 5 F's at Vanderbilt and 4 F's and a D at Tennessee, so Tennessee was easier. But he was a great guy, and of course he's made a great success. He kind of played around like I did during those early years.
So you actually played for General Neyland?
Well, I was playing for, like I say, about a month, and then we went up for the summer and worked out, and then I decided I'd try something else. But I lived in the football dormitory my first year. I got an opportunity to at least do that and eat at them.
There were some pretty well-known football players back then.
Oh boy, they had Lars Sella and Pug Pierman, as a matter of fact, was up there. And that Pug took another year to get out. I won't tell the story about him. He's downstairs here. He was for a long time. But he was caught one time just for an exam in a garbage can looking for tests, or at least accused of it. He said no. He said he'd just been given a new luminous dial watch, and he was trying to see what it looked like. One of the great tales that, needless to say, he was expelled, and that gave him another year to play.
But he ended up being one of the best players they ever had.
Absolutely, and a great guy.
So you were up there with a lot of the players in that great class of great year of 1950.
Stroud was on up there, and Sherrill and Sherrod. And a fellow from Memphis, the greatest story up there, a lawyer. In fact, Jackson, lawyer that you probably know, name escapes me right now, but he was up there, and he got his knee hurt in the summer, and ended up holding the ball for extra points and field goals for the entire 5-year scholarship that he was on. I'll think of his name maybe as we go on, but he's a lawyer, still practicing law. He was a SEC referee in basketball and in football. And Harold Johnson. Johnson. He'd been a great all-state player at Jackson. He was up there my first year. He was an SAE and so forth.
So how'd you get along at the University of Tennessee?
I got along fine. I had some good days and some bad, but I finally decided that I needed one more layer of discipline. Castle Heights had been good, but the trouble with Castle Heights was it got you so far ahead that when I went up to Tennessee, I'd take something like ancient history or algebra, and it was a review of what I'd had in high school. And the result was I wouldn't study, and the result was I wouldn't go to class, and so finally it caught up with me, and I said, well, I don't want any C's or D's or whatever in my class, and I didn't. Certainly wasn't going to fail out of school. I knew I was eventually going to be a lawyer, and of course that put me in the Marine Corps when I was 18.
And I'm going to ask you about that, but you said you knew you were eventually going to be a lawyer. When did you make that decision?
Oh, I'm sure I made that at the age of 4 or 5. Every night at my table, of course, my father, who always wore his coat, tie, vest, whatever, at the dinner table. You know, we had to sit there like, I don't know, it reminded me of something like back in the 1600s in England. But he would talk law, he would talk about his cases. On Saturday and Sunday, he would pick up that old cylinder type of dictaphone that he had and talk into this horn, you know, and dictate, and I'd be talking about it. And he'd be telling us about the case he had and this and that and the other thing. And that was all I heard about all my life. I mean, there was nowhere else for me to go. I had no thought ever about being anything but a lawyer.
Hmm. Well, you decided to be a United States Marine.
Yeah, I enjoyed that time. That was an interesting time. My first year was, I guess, fun. I left here, went to Paris Island. I will forget that first night as long as I live. Great night. They would jump you right off the bat, call you every name they can think of, and of course I knew I had been through that type of hazing before up at Heights as a freshman, and so I kind of laughed at it and took it with a grain of salt. A lot of those kids had really, you know, kind of got them down. I ended up being a commander, so to speak. I don't know what you called it back in those days, but a head of my platoon, which was number 7 for 1949. I've got the picture somewhere. In fact, I looked for it. I carried the guide arm or whatever that honor was, and I enjoyed that. I enjoyed the whole deal. I enjoyed the rifle range. I wasn't as good as some of them, but I did all right. And I especially enjoyed every time, every group, as you know, was assigned for 1 week as a mess detail. We got our job assigned to the new women Marines, and that made an interesting week out of that. You know, you've been up there, I think, about 9 weeks. You come from the University of Tennessee, and you know, just hot-blooded, going to the mountains every chance you got. Suddenly thrown into an all-male thing for 11 weeks, and then suddenly you're waiting tables for these women who are wearing T-shirts. I mean, it was just a horror story. I don't know how I survived that deal, but I made it.
How'd you and the DI get along?
I got along okay. They were a tough group. They were mean, but I recognized right away that they could be. You know, if you just did what they said, you'd be okay.
So you and
I had no trouble there.
You and the drill instructors did okay.
Did okay.
And do you still remember who your senior drill instructor
No,
was?
I can picture him as well as I can picture my name. I know my second man looked just like a pig. I mean, he just absolutely, I just almost expected an oink to come out of his mouth. But the sergeant, he was like a corporal or whatever, and I don't think he had been anywhere or done anything, but the sergeant had been everywhere. You got to remember, this is 1949. So we still had that World War II guy that had been a private at Iwo Jima and Okinawa and everywhere else. We still had them right with us, and he had been there and done that, and we respected him. It was no problem to obey him.
And where did they send you after boot camp?
Well, again, the fortunes of war, you know, being as they are, they said, you fill out this thing. If you made a good grade, you got to put down choices. Well, I didn't put down Millington, but they figured that would be a good place. So I got sent to the far reaches of the world, Millington, Tennessee, 30 miles away from Memphis, which made my father just about throw it in. He just said, well, here you're in. We've finally gotten you into some crowd that's going to discipline you and shape you up and get you going in the world, and lo and behold, you're going to be right here eating at my table. And, you know, he had seen me being sent off to Alaska, you know, Guam or wherever, but I enjoyed it and learned a lot. I got out here to the Millington and got eventually got into a 28-week school in radar, which I stayed with during that tour, and then when the Korean War broke out and I got called back in, it was a great benefit to me in that type of work in the Marine Air Corps.
Well, that was one of the toughest fields that you could get into at the time, wasn't it?
Well, it was, but frankly, it was not that hard, really. You know, for me. I mean, they take you through the thing out here at the school, 28 weeks. I mean, you know, they could probably teach it all in a month if they, you know. But we'd go to school every day, all day, and so they kind of spoon fed it to me, and I was able to absorb it.
When you got out to the fleet and the Marine Corps, what did you end up doing then?
Well, I was always basically involved in the teaching during the Korean War we had a lot of returning pilots who had flown F-4Us and all kinds of Marine aircraft, which were always hand-me-downs from the Navy, as you know. And these F-7Fs, the Squadron 521, LT 521, at Cherry Point was used as a place where they would teach these older pilots who were returning how to use radar, how to read it, and how to fix it, and do these different things with it. And that's what I was doing, so that every day almost at the Cherry Point we'd take off and fly to somewhere like Jacksonville to the Lejeune or somewhere, run bombing runs, and then back, and that's what I did.
And from what we understand, Judge, you did okay in the rank department as well. You became a staff non-commissioned officer before you got out.
I did. I had about less than 3 years, and I made staff sergeant. So that's, I guess, for that time, that was a rapid promotion. I don't know what they do now. Seemed like everybody in the Marine Corps is a staff sergeant or above.
I think that, Judge, that still would be considered quite an accomplishment, even today.
Well, I enjoyed the Marine Corps, and of course I didn't come close to getting to your rank of general, but I enjoyed every minute of it. And as the word is said, once a Marine, always a Marine, and that's the way I feel about it. If another person has been in the Marine Corps, that just gives them another for me. It just raises their status one notch.
The former governor of Georgia, Zell Miller, wrote a book on what he called the guides for life that he learned out of the Marine Corps, and considered one of the most meaningful times of his life. Did you feel the same way?
Oh, I did. There's no question about it. It was outstanding. The people in there were outstanding. During my tour of duty, there was very little crime, anything involving Marines out here at the base. Navy people getting in trouble almost daily. But the Marines were the ones, of course, that pretty well were taking care of business.
Judge, you got out of the Marine Corps and you went back to college. Did you feel like you were more mature by that time? Or?
Well, about 5,000%. I think I had about a 2, 4, 5, something like that, going back to college. Of course, I'd also married. In fact, when I came back to school here at Memphis State, after the Marine Corps, I had a boy, a son, John, who's now 48 years old. And when I went, we lived out in a little old apartment out there off of Southern by the railroad track, and the three of us, I worked a full 8-hour shift at the Light Gas Water out on Chelsea, and those were great days. I had an average out there. I think I was second in the entire school, or second in my class, or whatever. I don't know what it was, but it was. I took 18 hours a quarter and made, I think, 3 Bs and all the rest A's. So that was the difference between, floating off to the mountains on Thursday and coming back next Tuesday, and actually going to class and reading the books and catching up with the work. Then I went to law school. Of course, by the time I finished law school, I had 3 children. I had 2 born in Knoxville while I was in law school, my next girls. And those were great days. I loved every minute of law school. What a difference in law school now and then. For example, in my day, we had the first black at the University of Tennessee, a fellow named R.B.J. Campbell, he was a CPA. He was from Nashville, and they kept his grades in a constant C. He never made anything but C's, I don't think, all the way through, because they wanted to have him under control, and they wanted to be sure that if they decided he wasn't going to make, he'd suit them. That's how he got into school. A total world's turned over since then. There was one girl in the class. She didn't last the first quarter. I don't know whether it was harassment or whether she just dumb, but anyhow, I didn't really know her much. But she went quickly, and now I understand that 50% of them are at least girls. And of course, they're editing the law review and doing the whole thing. Of course, down here in these courts, they fill them up. It's a total change. I have a son that I told you that was a lawyer, and one of my daughters is a lawyer as well. So. And
you have 2 other children.
I have 2 other children.
Are they connected with the law at all?
No, Johnny practices here. My daughter, Laura, has practiced all over the country. She married a fellow that was in the hospital business, I guess you'd call it. He worked for some major company that sent him into psychiatric hospitals. He's been in Detroit and Kansas City, here, there, and yonder. I always had the feeling, frankly, that every time my daughter began to shine as a lawyer and outdo him, that he'd pull up stakes and move. But she's a whiz. She was my valedictorian at Central, about top of the class at Virginia, and then went to law school at William & Mary. And she's now down in Savannah, Georgia, and still practicing law long distance via the internet or something, and doing very well.
And your other 2 children?
Well, one child is a secretary. You mentioned the law. One child is a secretary, or whatever they call secretaries now, assistants or aides or whatever, to the Attorney General over in Little Rock, and works for him. And the other daughter is married to an engineer up in Virginia.
Mm-hmm. Were you pleased, Judge, that at least 2 of your children went into the law?
I was very pleased. And neither one of them, in my opinion, ever exhibited, until they really got through college or got into the middle of college, any either aptitude or desire to be involved in the law. I always thought Johnny would be a lawyer. He had an opportunity to know Daddy more than the rest of them, because Daddy died when the rest of them were small. And I think he enjoyed the law when I talked to him about it. But he was going to be an English teacher until he realized what English teachers were paid. and then he decided he'd try the law. Kathy was going to be, she was involved in biology, and going to be a biology teacher. And she went to Williamsburg with her husband, and they had no place for biology teachers, so she said, well, I'll just go to William and Mary and get a law degree. And she's probably, I always wish that she would move back to Memphis and practice law.
Before I leave your career at the law school at the University of Tennessee, I wanted to ask you whether or not the people that you were there with were people who have stayed friends with you through the course of the years.
Well, some have, but very few. One of the best friends I had up there went into the FBI and moved all over the country, and every now and then he'd come by and I'd talk to him. And then he eventually went out and went to work, I think, for the Texas prison system as a chaplain, and went into the ministry. In fact, I think he went into the Episcopal ministry, which I'm a member of the Episcopal Church, and went out there. And frankly, his sister, who I would see from time to time, died, and then I lost. I really don't know whether he's alive or dead. I ended up graduating in a funny time. I was a December graduate because I started in September and went straight through.
Right.
And with all those children all bouncing around, I had to do, get out and start making. I think we got, I forgot what, $170 a month, I think, from the government during that period. So I didn't really have a lot of time to hang around the law school, but I had one good friend I had was the head of the Tennessee Bar Association, Ace Campbell. He and a fellow that Ayers, Terrell Ayers, who was Ayers Hall, kind of
right.
up at UT. They were good friends, but the reason they were such close friends is that they took notes. I didn't have any notes, didn't know anything about notes. So every time they had an exam, they'd come out, I'd furnish the beer, they'd furnish the notes, I'd make an A and they'd make a B or C. That way I just pursued a good course through the school on their backs. They were a great help. Of course, they had to put up with the yelling, screaming children, but they were good friends.
What about your professors up there? Did you feel like you were getting good instruction?
I did feel like I was getting, of course, I didn't really know what to compare it with, but I feel like I got in the long run. I had one guy that just about put me to sleep daily, Dix Noel. Nicest guy in the world, but very, just sing song about his little tort cases, and just, I'd drift off here and there. I had a fellow named Lacey that was a young fellow that was excellent, I thought, in the contracts.
That would be Forrest Lacey.
Forrest Lacey. And they had some excellent teachers. The man that taught practice, Tennessee practice, was a lawyer for the University. Ball, he was excellent. And that criminal law, which I had no interest in, I never have had any interest in. The only time I got involved in a criminal case was when my daddy was assigned me to one nice woman. She got bombed out, ran into a police car down on 2nd. Would not plead guilty. I had to go over and try her. I did try her. I knew that if I threw the thing in the judge's hands, he'd do better than the jury, but I missed the boat. When he got through with the trial, instead of a $500 fine, which I think the jury would have probably gave her 3 days in jail, whereupon she collapsed and fell out on the floor, and that was the end of my criminal practice. I figured I better stay out of that arena. That was not for me.
Well, let's see, you came back to Memphis, and what year was it that you actually got out of law school and came back to practice?
I got out in December of '55 and actually got my license early in March, I think, of 1956. At that time, my father, of course, was Chandler, Shepard, High School, Williams, Beal, and Wall. It was a long list of folks. And I went up there, I think, I don't know who all was up there. Harry Kempka was my next door neighbor. He was still up there. They were working on the famous Butler, Jimmy Butler case. I don't know whether you remember or not, but it was a great case, great lawsuit.
That was a big bankruptcy
Big
case.
bankruptcy case growing out of when he cheated everybody on warehouse receipts for soybeans. But, and as I understand it, became a millionaire while in prison. I mean, he'd go to the phone and, say buy, and they'd all buy, and he'd make a big money. He's a sharp guy.
Well, Judge, you started as an associate in a large firm.
Started as an absolute peon. I mean, I don't know what the pay was, but I know that it was below minimum wage. I remember that. And here I am, my wife, 3 children. Luckily, I was able to rent a place over on Carr or wherever that didn't take much money, duplex, and enjoyed it. But I started at the bottom of the bottom. I mean, I was the low man on the totem pole. I'd get things like I went up to Missouri one time early on to get a child back who had, the child had been given to the daddy over the summer, and he wouldn't return it. They sent me up there. I knocked on the door and heard a click. Said, "No, you don't want this boy, do you?" And I said, "No, sir, I really don't." I went back and got my car and drove to the sheriff's office and let the sheriff go out there and get the boy. But when I heard that trigger go back, just I said, but that's the kind of jobs I had early on, and I enjoyed that. But after a few years, for whatever reasons, and I really don't know the depth of the reason, or the real reason, Daddy decided to leave that group and formed an association with Charlie Morgan, who at that time did most of the work, almost all the work, for a large insurance company, and Jim Manier, who was probably as good a practitioner as there was in the city, and myself, and we started that Chandler, Morgan, Manier, and Chandler, and moved into the brand new Edway building at that time over there at Jefferson and 2nd. Those were good years. Those were about 6-7 years of real interesting law practice.
What kind of cases were you handling?
Well, we handled everything. We handled everything. I handled anything that came down the pike. As a matter of fact, that's one of the things that has changed, I think. I noted the other day when I was up here that 2 of your finest lawyers were representing the plaintiff. And that was just, almost, my eyes almost bugged out when they told me that they had this case. Looked like about, I don't know how many million, but it was a big case. And that they had gone to the plaintiff's side. Back in those days, we handled everything. My father represented a lot of probate work. He represented plaintiffs. He represented that first big malpractice case in the federal court where a young boy's penis was burned off. He represented Harvester, the Baptist Hospital, the Yellow Cab Company, and he represented for 2 or 3 labor unions. I know the electrical workers, laborers. An interesting story there. The laborers union had like 10 whites and 5,000 blacks in the union, and the 10 whites held all the offices. And they had no elections for something like 22 years. So finally the federal government said, "Wait a minute, y'all better have an election." And that changed that deal, but that was one of his, he represented them.
Did you do much trial work?
Did a lot of trial work, nothing huge, and about, I guess, 5 cases that were appealed to the Supreme Court and so forth. Fortune case where first time they'd ever held a horse that threw a person without any previous bad activity, and the plaintiff won. An interesting case. We went after, instead of the usual proclivities or whatever to throw somebody, went after the fact that they had the wrong kind of saddle, the wrong kind of bit, the wrong kind of this, that, and the other, and so forth. Also had a case where my man was electrocuted while building high school here, and they tried the case. We tried it, as a matter of fact, twice. It was appealed back, tried it again, and we lost. And I went out to ask the jury, and I talked to one of the fellows there that seemed like he was nice, and I said, what in the world? That fellow was a World War II hero. He's in the Sahara, he's in DF, everywhere. And I said, there's no question that he was badly electrocuted, and light gas water was at fault. He said, no. He said, don't you know he was a painter, and all painters were drinking heavily. I'm sure he was drinking heavily that day. No drinking had ever been mentioned. You understand what I mean? So I felt, you got to watch unwritten things with juries, and that taught me a good lesson, that you just can't take a jury for granted that all painters in some people's minds drink. Another guy one time gave us a good verdict, and I was for the defendant and gave a very low verdict. And I never will forget, I asked the guy why he got such a low verdict. He said, well, my brother was killed at the Battle of the Bulge, and says he only got $10,000. Of course, they're talking about insurance rather than liability. Mm-hmm. But I enjoyed my trial work, and I probably would have kept on with it, except, as you know, the government changed. All of a sudden, we had a whole new government in the city where we used to have 5 commissioners, and they were elected, and they was a full-time deal, and I sure didn't want to get involved in that type of activity. All of a sudden, they had 13 council people, or whatever they call them, council persons, and I got into that race, and of course won. And that was going to be a little easy part-time job. I'd go down there on Tuesdays and enjoy myself and talk about the great glories of our city and build it up to, you know, the house on the city on the hill. And of course, lo and behold, within a month, we were embroiled in the strike of the nation. I guess one of the biggest in the nation's history.
I'm going to ask you. I'm going to get back to that in just a minute, Judge. But before I leave your practice with your father, I think it's almost mandatory that we spend a few minutes on what Chief Justice Earl Warren called the most vital decision of his years on the United States Supreme Court. The case of Baker versus Carr, the one man, one vote case. Tell me, your father was lead counsel. What did you participate?
I participated very little. He worked primarily with a couple lawyers up in Nashville, and they exchanged information. He would run things off of me, ideas. I thought the greatest statement in the whole thing was that the goats or whatever, the cows in Moore County had more votes than the people in Shelby County. As you recall, Moore County, which is carved out of 4 other counties so they could manufacture liquor during Prohibition, that county had 1 representative, and Shelby County had, you know, about, I don't know how many times as many people, had 6. We had 6 representatives and 3 senators, and of course immediately after the case went down, it was decided went to 18 and we had 6 and 3, and now we have 18 and 6. So it was 3 times. We were 3 times shorted. But he went. I never will forget how heartbroken he was. He went to the legislature and he asked the legislature. He says, "I don't want to bring this case. I don't want the federal government to decide our fate. The Constitution says you're supposed to reapportion the legislature every 10 years, and I just do it." And no, we don't listen to that. Of course, as you know, the rural people ran the state and still do. And they scoffed and laughed. They allowed him to make his speech and then bid him goodbye. And he went on with the case, and eventually the Supreme Court said he was right and changed the whole course, maybe of the country. And I'm not necessarily think it's for the best as far as Shelby County. We had 6 people dedicated to the best interest of Shelby County before it in the legislature, in the lower house. And now we have 18, all of which think the other 17 are a bunch of fools. And there's no getting together on anything, especially when they're divided into 6 white Democrats, 6 black Democrats, and 6 white Republicans. They just yap, and they never get anything done, and nobody in the state has any respect for us at all.
Judge, did either you or your father think that the result of Baker versus Carr was going to be to give much more power to minorities?
I don't think that mattered to him. I don't think he thought about it in that manner. I say that. I don't know. He was certainly, I think, always a fair-minded fellow. He was a man of his times. That's what people have got to realize, that he was brought up in an era when segregation was not just something you gave lip service to. It was the way that he had been brought up. Remember, he was born in 1886. That's 30 years or whatever after the Civil War. And I mean, you know, I'm sure he was filled in Jackson, Tennessee, with a lot of talk about slavery and what was happening to the South and what was happening to the good white folks, etc. But he was never a vicious man about it. He certainly never didn't want anybody. He was on the board of directors at Lemoyne Owen. And as a matter of fact, one of the sad things about all this was he had been on that board for 10 years. He had been the head money raiser one of those years. And then he was hired by the city of Memphis to represent, I think, the library in the segregation and the integration cases. And as soon as he was hired and took the job, they removed him from the board in a big flurry of activity, as if he was some miscreant. That's just the way things were back in those days, and they were tough.
Lemoyne, of course, for those who see this tape, would be the #1 black college.
Yeah, absolutely.
In
a
this
fine
area.
black college in a great institution, which now is apparently in some financial trouble itself.
Judge, what about while you were in the practice, either in a law firm or as a solo practitioner, did you do any pro bono work?
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. We always had to do pro bono work. Some of it not necessarily to I was crazy about. And I was appointed by the federal court many times to represent criminals that had no money. Generally speaking, that turned into a deal where you pled them out and tried to work out a better deal. One of my great remembrances of that activity was that they caught a fellow that was a robber. He had robbed some deal, armed robbery in Boston, had driven all the way to Memphis and was going by East High School out in East Memphis, and apparently had his lights up or something bright, or was going too fast or whatever, and the crossing guard out there stopped him. He got out and said, "Okay, you got me," and surrendered to her. And they had him down there, and I represented him in his trial. I figured he was too dumb to be of a great danger. I kind of pled the dumbness plea, but they sent him away. Of course, at that time, as you know, they had, I won't say the hanging judge, but Marion Boyd didn't take much from the criminals. And most federal felons made a wide swath around Memphis. They didn't come near Memphis.
Did you have any favorite judges in the state court back in those days that you enjoyed trying cases before?
Well, I really enjoyed trying cases before every one of them. To me, they were all gentlemen. The real difference in the state courts now, I mean, you had people like Holmes, you had Quick, you had Judge, I won't leave out all their names, but
Judge Wilson?
You had Judge Wilson, Judge Quick, you had Judge Adams, Henderson. I sat for Henderson one time. Again, early in my practice, I had made the newspapers with giving custody of a dog in a divorce case, and I wasn't asked to go back and sit for him again. Made headlines in, I think, Los Angeles or something, and he kind of said, "I think you better give up the judiciary, Chandler." But they were all gentlemen. The difference is that those men were, of course, they were the same. They were all highly responsible, highly respected, highly trained attorneys, most coming from a defense background. But people would come to them, unlike today when it's a popularity. They'd come and they'd say, "Now, Judge Henderson, you're 62 years old. You've made a lot of money in the practice of law. We're going to ask you to make a sacrifice. We don't pay anything as a judge, but we need some quality men on that bench, or women or whatever, and would you do it?" "All right, I'll do it." He'd run a bar primary. He would overwhelmingly win, and he'd take over the job. If there was anybody in the race that wanted to be a judge and they lost, they stepped aside. They didn't run in the general race, except with rare exceptions. In that way, you had the quality men with experience. They'd all tried a lot of cases. They knew what trials were about. They had decorum, they had judgment, and they were just a marvelous group. I loved them. I mean, I was crazy about them all.
Was there any thoughts going through your mind at the time that may be something you'd like to do in your future?
Well, I thought about it. As a matter of fact, when I was on the council, I gave some thought to it and actually put out some feelers about it. But I think it was Thorpe's time to run, and Thorpe was much better qualified than I, and he went ahead and ran without, I didn't get in that race.
That was Judge Jim Thorpe, and you ultimately served with him when you did become
I
judge.
did, and was honored to do so. And his death was very untimely as far as I was concerned. He was an excellent judge, had a fine judicial man, and a great sense of humor.
Judge, I want to try to cover another one subject, and then we'll take a break. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about, you were in solo practice when you were elected as one of the first councilmen in the new city, county, or city mayor council type of government for Memphis. Right. Why did you decide to run for the council?
Well, to be honest with you, I'd always had an interest in government. You know, when you grow up in a house where your father's a congressman, not that I knew what a congressman was for most of the time, but he was still in Congress when I was 9 and 10, and I used to go up at least to the Army-Navy game. It was my only trip to Washington every year. And then when I was during my young, 10 to 16, he was a mayor, and I was shaking hands with Ed Crump, and I was having Frank Clement come to put his wares down to be chosen as a governor, and that kind of thing. It kind of gets in your blood. Every year I'd go to march in the parade with Daddy and get the yells of the crowd. I'd be the one to give the key to the Santa Claus at the Christmas parade. That type of thing appealed to me. I felt that with a 13-member group, that I would fit in nicely, that I could put forth my views and be of help. And that's why I got in it, and I never regretted it.
As it turned out, Judge, that first city council had some of the real giants of Memphis as a part of it.
It was by far, in my opinion, and I've been, as you know, traveled everywhere. And when I was mayor, I had a lot of interest. I was on the board of directors of the National Mayors Conference and went to every city almost in the country. That was the finest group of members of a governing body of a city, I would believe, in the history of this country. I mean, there's never been anything like it. You had Lewis Donaldson, you had Blanchard Toole, you had the owners of one of the biggest car places. You had Philip Perrell, who was an outstanding jeweler. You had Ms. Gwen Awesome, who was, I guess, a Republican when they were locking other Republicans in the attic. You know, when there weren't many Republicans abroad in those days. But there was all the way across the board. Even we had, as you know, the first blacks in the government since Reconstruction. They were outstanding. Fred Davis served with distinction both during and after my tour, and did well. A fine insurance man. We had Reverend Netters, who's now got streets named after him, and is a preacher of the biggest black church probably in the city. And J.O. Patterson, who's now, I guess, a bishop on his way to the top notch in the church that he's associated with. It was a fine group, and it's always been troubling to me that we were beset with that early crisis within, I'm saying, just a few weeks. And it was before anybody gave us a chance to really get about the business of settling in to be what we could have been.
Tell us about the crisis.
Well, of course, the crisis arose because the city of Memphis had a horrible history, really, in the area of personnel. The actual crisis arose because of an effort to unionize the people that worked for the sanitation department. Brought about, however, by the death of 2 sanitation workers who had been caught up in one of these sanitation trucks and crushed. Back in those days, each time that a person was injured, there was no workers' comp, there was no anything. The head man of the division of the commission back in the pre-new government days would go before the board and say, that's a nice fellow, we ought to give him $10,000. All right, and they give him $10,000. Well, maybe he'd be a policeman and he'd be worth $25,000. Or maybe he'd be a fireman and worth $15,000. But it was a kind of a come see, come saw, no organized thing, and So when these people were killed and there was no outcry and no big deal, they've been trying to get organized for years. Now, let me just say one thing in the defense of Henry Loeb, who was the mayor and who kind of been castigated. This was not, at the outset, and really never should have been, a racial matter. This was a union matter. It was an organizing matter. Memphis has one of the great cities of the world for being against organized labor. When they tried to organize all the whites in the fire department several times, even I think during Daddy's administration, they were turned back. They wouldn't allow them to have a bumper sticker on their bumper that said unionize. I mean, freedom of speech wasn't even allowed, that type of thing. The city never allowed anybody to organize. Whether they were black or white or green, they didn't care. They weren't going to be any unions. And of course, the state law said you can't be unionized, and city employees cannot be unionized. So when that thing struck, we had Frank Giannotti was our city attorney. He couldn't have been a better man. He was well qualified, and he told Henry Loeb, he says, you can't recognize these people. And that was all Henry needed to hear, and that was the end of it as far as he was concerned. So, as you know, we had a fellow named Ciampi, an Italian, looked like he'd stepped right out of the mafia definition in some encyclopedia, came down here and told Henry he was going to push City Hall into the river. And the city drew signs, and those signs stayed right there the entire time. They never moved. Meanwhile, all of us, quote us, the 13 councilmen, trying to intervene where you had two diametrically, in other words, you got two marginal lines shooting at each other. We're in the middle trying to deflect both sides, trying to find a middle ground to shut the shooting down. And they didn't give us a chance. Every time we try to do something, you remember the great deal when Fred Davis had a meeting at City Hall, and Jesse Epps came down and said, there's a cotton boll on the seal of the city. We ought to rip it down and rip the city down, because they're still reminding us that we picked cotton in the fields, that type of thing. They ate salami on the tables in front of at the council chamber. So everything got lost. It lost in words. I had, as I say, represented unions, knew that we could find a meeting of the minds, and we beginning to find them. But of course, at that time, King was killed, and that was the end of the game. All the people came down, stood up in Henry Loeb's office, and said, "You've killed King. You're a murderer. You've ruined the city. We'll be hated forever, etc." And so he just stepped aside. We took over, and we settled it overnight. That night, we stayed up all night and came to an agreement.
How long did it take to settle it after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King?
Well, I don't know, it was a week or two at the most. We got busy, but it was within a few days. There wasn't any question about what we would do. We were going to sidestep the contract by having a, quote, memorandum of understanding, as you know. There wasn't any fight for any money, so money was negligible, so it was easy to settle. All they wanted was the check off. The National Union wanted to check off the dues because it meant they paid them something like $39,000 a month, was taken out of the employees' hands and sent to Washington, D.C., to Jerry Worth and that union.
Judge, I know that at the time you received the praise of one of the black members of the council, Councilman Fred Davis, for your work behind the scenes. That must have been a big part of your effort at the time.
Well, I tried. Everybody tried. Nobody tried more than anybody. Blanchard, of course, it just about killed him. His tragic situation almost with him.
That was Jared Blanchard.
Jared Blanchard, who later, of course, practiced law, I think, with you at one time and was an outstanding attorney. But he was a man of great conscience, and I never will forget his famous speech. He said he'd been for the strike the whole time, been for beating him. And we were going to beat him, you understand that. The strike had been beaten. There was not going to be a union. And that's why when I first heard it, as a matter of fact, about the law, I was taking a deposition in the UP Bank building when somebody said King was shot, and I immediately thought to my head, Dave shot him, the union, because that was the only way they could win that battle. course, they won the battle, but it turned out it was some nut rather than them. But Jared made a speech in which he said he's been against them being recognized the whole time. But he sat at his home last night and looked at the ashes in his fireplace, and he could see Memphis being in those ashes, and he was changing his mind. He was going to vote to give him recognition. So it bore hard on him.
Well, Judge, you finished your service as a councilman, and then decided to run for mayor, and you were elected. And when we come back, I want to ask you a few questions about that.
I'll be glad to.
Judge, before I leave the sanitation workers strike and the what at some point was called a split of the council in its support of Mayor Henry Loeb, I want to go back and ask you to, if you would, to comment on what may have been the public's understanding, or maybe the understanding now, that the strike was over the checkoff and not over whether or not the union could organize.
Well, I think early on, all of the people in the government realized that we could not keep a group of employees from calling themselves some kind of an organization. I think it was important that we not affiliate them with the national union, but even there, I think that could have been done. As a matter of fact, they were offered reasonably early on the option of being organized, being a union, but paying their own dues. They had to take the money out of their checks every month and send it to anybody they want to. This fellow Worth, who was the head of the union, and that would have been the end of it. They refused to do that. They would never do that, and that was really the final straw, that Henry Loeb simply could not tolerate the idea of not only recognizing them, not only dealing with them in some manner, but of being the collector of the dues for them. In other words, we took it out automatically at $16, whether they asked or not or whatever, and sent it off to Jerry Worth in AFSCME in Washington. And he wouldn't do it and refused to do it. And if they had accepted that, it would have been done. I think they were asking for something like 4 cents, 5 cents an hour. That was the raise, which was nothing. They were underpaid, but so were the firemen, the policemen, everybody in city government was underpaid. I'm not sure what underpaid is. There was a waiting list to be hired on as a garbage worker. And I mean, it wasn't some deal where we were forcing anybody into forced labor. They were coming down there begging for the job, getting the job, and then, of course, they have a right to petition, in my opinion, for redress of their grievances, to ask for more money and to come in with somebody representing them to ask for it. That didn't bother me a bit. We at that time, for example, hired almost all of the electricians, carpenters, painters, etc., through the union halls. If the city needed something done, some painting done at City Hall, they called the painters union, and they sent 3 people out there, and they paid them whatever wages was called on. So it wasn't anything new to deal with unions, but it was different to have them check off, collect the money for the union. He just wasn't up to that.
But for the assassination of Dr. King and the trauma that followed, how do you think the strike would have ended?
Well, I think eventually it would have ended the same way all other efforts to organize in that manner had ended in the city's history, which goes back a long way. We were having more and more people working every day. I'm not saying everybody was back by a long shot. We had new employees. We were actually picking up the garbage on a semi-regular basis, maybe the same way they are now, once a week. Before, we were picking up twice a week. But a lot of things came to light during that strike that when I was on the council with people like Donaldson and others, Blanchard, we changed. That idea about 10,000 for him, 15 for him ended. We have the same workers' comp. Workers' comp applies across the board to all city employees, even though they're not under workers' comp. And that raises an interesting issue I'll talk to you about some other time, not now, about this whole, are you made whole? There's going to be an interesting question on that. But they would probably have lost. I'm not sure whether in the long run they wouldn't have gotten just as much as they've gotten. Strangely enough, that union, the AFSCME union, when I took office, I had less trouble with them than any union in the city. I didn't have any trouble with the trade unions because I had known them, many of them, all my life, I guess, and represented some. But the AFSCME union, if you recall, stuck with the city when the firemen and the policemen struck. They crossed the picket lines. They wouldn't listen to anything they had to say, and they stuck right with us all during that strike. So I had a relationship with Reverend Smith that was second to none. But it was an interesting thing that everybody has not realized that all through the history of Memphis, they've never recognized them before. And it was that battle that we lost, in my opinion, because King was killed. And that's the only thing that possibly would have beaten us.
Judge, you made a decision a couple of years after that you wanted to become the mayor.
Well, that's a long story, too. I had talked to Henry about it on many occasions. At that time, Bill Morris, of course, was sheriff. Bill had high hopes. Bill, in fact, had run against Henry for the mayorship. Lost, and I knew he was preparing to run again. I also knew that Judge Kenneth Turner was preparing to run. And I was kind of laying back. I had actually qualified to be a councilman. I was a chairman of the council. I enjoyed it. I knew I'd hold on another 4 years and then maybe run. Well, I got a call one morning from Henry Loeb. He said his wife had just thrown a biscuit in his face and told him if he ran for this mayor again, she was out of there. That was the end of it. She was going over and live in Arkansas, and he could just write her every now and then, and that'd be as much as he was going to see her. So he said, I've got to get out of it. Will you run? I know you want to, and I'd rather have you in there than Bill Morris. And so I said, sure. And no time I was in the race. Morris had already gotten all his signs out, handing out his literature. Turner was passing out things and gotten all his minions out there at the juvenile court. You know, he has all kind of people that help people in every area. So I knew it was going to be a tough race. I figured that it was going to be Turner would get the black vote, as he did, and of course it would be between Morris and I and the white vote. I'll tell you an interesting story about that. He was a Parkway Village man. I never had heard of Parkway Village, frankly, before this race. I knew there was something out there in the east, but I lived in Midtown. Anything past Parkway was getting, toward Nashville. So anyhow, about that time, Elvis gave Bill Morris a Mercedes-Benz. And about that time, Morris also, I don't know whether he came into money as a sheriff, which was paying about $10,000 a year, but he moved into a ritzy neighborhood out east, moved out of the Parkway Village. So I went out to Parkway Village, which I figured was going to be a pretty heavy voting area, and it certainly should be Morris. He'd lived there for 20 years. And told everybody out there in about 4 speeches over 4 nights that if they had a Mercedes and a tennis court in their yard like he did, vote for him. Otherwise, I'd appreciate their vote. And I carried it by 90% or something. So, but that was the toughest race I had. As you know, I won by 1,800 votes, 200 votes per precinct, because Judge Turner, who had been down there I don't know how long, it seemed like forever, he got 98% of the black vote and made it tough.
Judge, Henry Loeb was known, I guess, as one of the best campaigners that the city had had in a long time. What do you think of his style, and did that help you?
Well, I emulated it. I'd been with him on his campaigns. Let me just tell you how he would do. For example, he left no stone unturned. He knew everybody. Everybody knew him. He stood out in a crowd. He'd take that coat off, and get down to his shirt sleeves. He would come into a building like this. He'd walk in unannounced, or maybe he'd have a quote front man come in. Henry Lowe was going to come by, Mayor Lowe. Would you mind letting him shake hand? No, of course, come in. He'd come running in. He'd shake your hand, go right through this building, go to every office here, say every secretary, every person. You'd say, well, wait a minute, I want to talk to you, man, Henry, about the street lights. They're not working in my neighborhood. He'd have another guy right behind him say, I'm sorry, Henry, we got to be, somewhere soon. Now, he'd never ride the elevator. It was down the steps, next floor, down the steps, next floor, zoop, 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 right on down, right on through banks. Didn't care whether the people would yell at him or whatever. He shook every hand in every building in the city. On Saturdays, which was his day at the malls or the shopping centers, he shook every hand in the city. Before he had gotten through, there were very few people in this city that either had not shaken his hand or had not lived next door to somebody, had somebody in their family that had shaken his hands, and he'd come home saying, Henry Lowe shook my hand. And that's what I did, and it is effective. I still, to this day, have little old ladies walk up and say, oh, yeah, I remember when you ran for mayor that first time, you came out to Parkway Village and shook my hand on such and such. And it's music to my ears. I mean, that really means something, and that's, of course, what we don't have with the presidential elections and governors, but you do for mayor. And it really puts you close to the people.
Did you enjoy that?
Oh, I enjoyed every minute. It wore me down to a frazzle. I lost, and maybe I can do it now. It might be good for me, but you lose a lot of weight, you lose a lot of sleep. I'd go some places sometimes. I've been to, in one luncheon, you'd eat coffee at one place, main meal at the next place, and dessert at the next one. And I'll never will forget one place I'm eating in on one of these clubs, and I said, and I'll tell you one thing, it's been wonderful to be with this crowd that's looked after the blind people, the wonderful lines, and the guy leans up, and says, this is the Rotary Club. I mean, you get to where you're just talking to whatever, So, but it is a great experience. Sometimes it's harder, I think, than serving as the actual job of mayor is running for it. It is very wearing.
Did you have a political party backing you?
I never had a political party backing me in anything. I was an independent. Henry was an independent, and of course my employee that followed me eventually, Brother Hackett, was all independents. I was never a member of any party. They've accused me of being slightly to the right of Genghis Khan. I don't know what that means, but I'm on a national scene. I guess I would be deemed to have voted for the Republicans. I certainly liked Baker and Brock and those kind of people, and Thompson. I like those. But I'd vote for Democrat in a minute if I thought he was a better person, and have.
When Henry Loeb left office, what was the feeling toward him from the members of the council?
Well, I think they still respected Henry Loeb. I think the only person that I've ever heard express real bitterness about him, I think, was Reverend Netters, and I don't know what went on between them, whether you know it or not, but when I took office, Reverend Netters was beaten by John Ford, of all people, who is, the bottom of the entire heap, in my opinion. But John Ford beat him, and John Ford, then I hired Netters and put him to work up there with me at City Hall. He and Hackett were my two right-hand men, so to speak. And I worked with him, but he was a little bitter toward Henry. He thought I think he thought Henry had promised that he was going to do something that he didn't do. I didn't understand it that way, but he felt that way, and I think that embittered him. But I think he was still well respected. He still ran the city. I think the last 3 years, though, a lot of the leadership in this city was under Lewis Donaldson. He asserted himself. He had the background. He had the intelligence, the fortitude, and he had come through the strike more or less unsullied. and so he became more or less the senior advisor and so forth. Strong.
But you ended up as the chairman of the council.
Well, that's right. I think I don't know. I think I'm not sure whether Louis had a crack at it or not. You didn't repeat yourself. You know, you wouldn't have to. I know that Tom Todd and I can't remember who all was chairman, but I was honored by it. But it wasn't any fight. I was Louis Donaldson didn't try to become or run against me or anything. He was, but I would say that he was the highlight of the council. It was a good council, and he was probably the best man on it.
And when you won the election and became the mayor, was that the first time a father and son had both been mayor?
I think so. I'm not sure that there's any other now. Of course, no telling what we're going to have down there now. But I don't believe there ever been a father and a son. We, of course, had Overton. I guess I'm not sure that his grandfather or somebody. I know that Overton was one of our founders, but I don't think he was ever a mayor. I don't think we ever had a father-son.
Your father came in to be the mayor while Boss Crump was in power. Is that a fair way to say it?
Absolutely, no question about it. You can call him Boss Crump. Of course, to me, he was a benevolent dictator, I guess you'd say. Later, they fell out a little bit, and that may have been the reason Daddy resigned in 1946. I really don't know. Daddy had been in Congress. He'd been voted one of the 10 outstanding congressmen every year. I think Crump was a little jealous of that. I think that didn't sound too good. He was kind of rising to the top. Well, he stayed up in 1940. He stayed up there, wouldn't come home to run because he had to vote, supposedly at least, on the rearmament of Guam. One of those islands out there, Truck or whatever it was, for Roosevelt, needed every vote he could get in the Congress. So that year, Crump ran, as you may know, himself for mayor. It was E.H. Crump running for mayor. He was elected. On January the 1st, as planned, and everybody knew this was planned, it wasn't hidden, they went down there. Crump was going to catch a early morning train to go down to the Sugar Bowl. And he got on the train, and Daddy got on the train, and Crump resigned, and Daddy was sworn in, and Daddy and I and my mother and my sister, I never will forget it, went back over to City Hall, quote City Hall, which was 2 rooms in the courthouse. It was the Shelby County Courthouse had the city mayor in it, and there was a big spray of flowers and a big to-do and a big celebration of everybody clapping and doing. But yes, he was a strong member of Mr. Crump's group. Crump had run the city pretty much, I guess, for about 25 or 30 years at that time, and Daddy and the group he was associated with thought he was doing a super job, and I think the people did too. He didn't force anybody to go to the polls, and I don't think it. I think he's just a good man.
Well, you were. How old were you when you were elected mayor as compared to when your father was made mayor?
Well, let's see. Daddy in 1940 would have been about 51 or 2, something like that, 53. In 1972, I was 42, so a little younger, but a little brasher, a lot brasher. I've got pictures of my father, and of course during that era, and his hair was gone. But he was a wonderful man. Crump was a wonderful guy. Crump would come to my house, talk to him sometimes, and he could tell you the ranking of the football teams. He knew how Tennessee was doing, Oklahoma, whatever. He could talk to you about almost any subject you want to talk about, and I think left a good taste in my mouth. I enjoyed it.
When you took over as mayor, what kind of shape was the city in?
Well, I think we were in fairly good shape. We had the problem that I faced immediately was the fact that we had annexed Whitehaven. Shortly thereafter, we annexed Raleigh. When you annex an area, you make gigantic commitments. You've got to bring their area up to standard. So we had tremendous sewers, drains, streets, roads, everything you can think of. All of the amenities, the fire, the police stations, and this, so forth.
Now, Whitehaven and Raleigh were two of the biggest, most spread out of the suburban areas in the
Whitehaven,
Memphis area.
had it been incorporated in its own right, would have been the fourth largest city, been larger than Jackson, any of those cities. It was a tremendous area, 131,000, something like that, people.
What was the significance you placed on the annexation and making it succeed?
Well, we worked hard at it. We put a lot of money in both those annexation areas eventually. We did a lot of capital improvements. One of my situations was that I wanted to do what I could. I had just been elected, like I say, by 96% of the white vote and 2% or 3% of the black vote. Almost gave you the idea that any black that voted for me just made a mistake, that maybe drunk or something, I don't know. But of course, now that I'm out of office, you understand, every black I walk into on the mall says, God, I wish you were mayor again, Mayor. I voted for you every time, but I don't know where they were. But anyhow, I went about and I worked hard, very hard, for example, I built 7 new community centers. There were only 2 in the city we built, and in the whole history of the city, too. Built 7 in 4 years, 6 of which were in black neighborhoods. We put a lot more capital improvements in the black neighborhoods, thinking not only probably is it fair, but also politically, I didn't want the city to be just 96 and 2. That didn't make any sense. And of course, after I'd done all of that, and I'd go out to these places and dedicate these things and have these bridges and so forth, and then all play, the bands would play and this and that. Out came Otis Higgs, a black mayor, mayorality candidate and mayoral candidate. And that all went down the drain. I got my same 2%, may have gone to 2.1, I'm not sure. But that's the way that went. Once you get into those races, it was a black-white situation from A to Z. We had Turner again. Turner, who had gotten 98% of the black the first time, got like 8 the second time in the 3-man race, and of course was eliminated. So that's a shame, but that's the way that situation was, and it was a carryover from the Henry Loeb days, because Henry Loeb had endorsed me, and I became another Henry Loeb in the black community, even though they didn't know me from Adam. They didn't know what I felt about anything.
I know you spent a lot of time and you brought some pretty effective people into government with you and tried to organize city government as a business.
I did, and I was very fortunate. I had people like early on a fellow named Huddleston who came here from Nashville, as a matter of fact.
That'd be Clay Huddleston.
Clay Huddleston, and he was my first CAO or whatever you'd call him, kind of a lesser city manager type of guy. He was excellent. He organized it. Henry Evans, then later, who was very similar, very high grade, high quality folks. Mosby, Marlon Mosby, an outstanding accountant and financier, I guess you'd say. Almost everybody that I had down there across the board after my term or during the term left and went on to make a lot more money. And I guess that's the only way that you can view where they were really just rinky-dinks brought in to do the job. In my opinion, they were highly qualified. And that's what I did. I think that was my forte. I could bring in, I could go out and sell myself to get people to make a sacrifice and to come into government and to get into their particular expertise, whether it's engineering or the law. Cliff Pierce, for example, Frierson Graves. You couldn't find 2 more outstanding lawyers in the city than those 2 gentlemen. and they were my city attorneys. They were like the Gennatis and the Veneers and the other vineyards before them. So I did pride myself, and do. Ms. Awesome, of course, did a wonderful job with her area. But I did, if there's one thing that I feel really good about, it was bringing in quality people. And, of course, it made my job a lot easier. You know.
Judge, you had some interesting days with the media back as a mayor, and I suppose you still remember the cartoonist for the Commercial Appeal, Draper Hill, who published that famous cartoon with the title, "The Mayor Needs Help."
I've got that on my wall at home.
Tell us about that.
Well, I won't tell you everything about it, but I will tell you that during that era, I might from time to time have a drink or two. And on this occasion, unknown to me, I went out with a young lady. I was divorced, and I was free to go out, and I went out and got to drinking a little more than I should. So I told her, I said, well, I want you to go call my bodyguard and get my bodyguard down here, and I think he's going to need to take me to my place. And instead of going to the phone and calling him, she thought, well, I'd just pick up his police radio here and call him on the police radio. So I remember, you know, that y'all talk back and forth from time to time. So she says, blap, 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 you know, punches the button and says, "The mayor needs help, Johnny." And of course that went out to every media, to Commercial Appeal, to the TV stations, to the entire police department, the fire department. Next thing happens, about 25 police cars arrive at this location she gave them, and of course I'm spirited off. And of course that brought on a lot of questions, which I simply just pled amazement. I don't know what you're talking about. What call? Must have been some fool stepped into my car.
What was your relationship with the media? Did you get along pretty well?
I got along very well, especially with the papers. I was even-handed. They live, you know, for the story. The first, get the story first. And of course, we had two papers, the Commercial and the Press, and I balanced them. This time, if it was a budget that they wanted to see, this one got the operating budget, this one got the capital improvement budget, this one got the announcement that we're going to hire so-and-so for the new chief of police, and this one got the story that we're going to do this and that. I was out with one of them, this, you know, I keep, again, these names have slipped my mind, but this lady that writes for the Commercial now worked for the Press and was with me for about 3 years. But she's the political writer. I don't know whether you've kept up with the political writers in the Commercial. But she said her best days were during those 3 years that she was down, and she was the Press, he was the Commercial Appeal, Press Senators, a girl at worked at City Hall. They were tough from time to time. I got into the famous, talking about the media, I got into the famous story about Bill Morris, and I wasn't Bill Morris, but I think it was John Getz and maybe Billy Ray Schilling, who was the sheriff at the time. Yeah. We went out to the square one time, and they had a big boob contest. And we were sitting there innocently, and they said, well, how about y'all judging it? We said, oh, okay. So we judged it, and went on about our business. We gave it actually to a flat-chested girl, brought down the house, and everybody kind of laughed about it, went on. About a month later on Mother's Day, they published it in the paper saying, you know, Chandler's been a big boob contest and whatever. So it ended up with Billy Ray Schilling being divorced and Getz being thrown out of his house for about a month. But they can't cover it up. And what I was getting to, that story died. And for 2 years, it was dead. And then one time, the National Guard came down to City Hall. They said, Mayor, we got this tank out here. We'd like for you to ride it around, kind of like the Dukakis deal or whatever. Mm-hmm. Ride it around. It's got rubber treads, won't hurt anything. Just ride it around, and maybe we'll get a little publicity and get people in the reserve. I said, well, put me in there. They put me in, rode me around. So the next morning, they had this paper that says, well, Chandler yesterday got in a tank, rode around the building. That's at least better than judging a big boob contest. Bring in that big boob. That was the end of that reporter. He never was allowed back in City Hall. But that's if they do that to you, that's bad. Just keep up, you know, do there was enough for me to fill up their column without going back and picking up something bad.
You were never one to mince your words. You always spoke your mind.
I did speak my mind, and even today I run into people who say, "Look, I didn't agree with the thing you did, Mayor, but I always knew where you stand and admired you for it, and I appreciated at least you were honest." I think, and especially in this world we live in today, that being just straight and honest has got to be better than even being smart and lying.
Judge, the media used to make a lot of hay over the feud that you had with United States Congressman Harold Ford Sr.
Well, it wasn't really a feud. I didn't have much to do with Harold Ford Sr. He didn't have much to do with me. I know that I'm now reminded that at one time I was called into battle to testify. It was a strange situation. I picked up the paper and began to read day after day that the federal government was now going to prosecute Harold Ford for coming to my office and trying to get something. I've forgotten what the quid pro quo was. Maybe he was going to give the city more money if I would give him this deal over there and
The Auction Street Bridge.
do something with the Auction Street Bridge so that his friend could make a development on the island. Well, number one, I didn't have any knowledge of anything like that. I think I remembered some people coming, but not Harold Ford telling me he'd do anything. And if you recall, my statement down there was very simple. Harold Ford wouldn't come and ask me anything because he figured if he did, he'd never get it. So he wouldn't waste his time, and it wasn't any. I never got any real cooperation out of Harold. The only thing that he worked with me, I think, in a unified fashion was on Beale Street. And he was able to give us some help there, but
you were talking earlier about actually you went to his trial, criminal trial in the federal court, and gave your testimony.
Oh, absolutely.
On his behalf.
Yeah, we all asked me to. I told you the truth. They all asked me to come, and I did. I don't back away from anybody.
Judge, Henry Evans, your CEO at one point, made the statement that during the two times that you ran for re-election, that you never put any pressure on any of either the big employees or the small employees of city government to either work for you or contribute or whatever. Why didn't you? I mean,
well, that didn't suit me. I remember when I grew up, they used to have the fights. It was an annual fight on the Hatch Act, the Little Hatch Act, and this Hatch Act, and that Hatch. And it frankly always worried me that the parties in being or the politicians in being would do that. I grew up, as you say, with Crump. It was always one of the things I didn't like about Crump is that he assigned every fireman, every policeman, their precinct and said, get out there and take a poll, get them all there that are going to vote for us and all that. I didn't like that. I just didn't, that wasn't my kind of deal. I never, I mean, I liked being mayor and I wanted to win, but I liked ads and debates and all those kind of things. That was mine. Not getting somebody, not asking some secretary to do some work for me. I would never do that.
Good. You served for 11 years as the mayor. After leaving a very successful law practice, did your legal training or being a lawyer, did that affect in any way your service as mayor?
Oh, there's no question about it. As I say, from labor dealings, having that background of dealing with labor problems and labor organizations, I don't see how anybody, frankly, can run a city or really a big business without having either being a lawyer or having a lawyer right there by your elbow as an advisor all the time. Everything we did down there had legal ramifications. Every contract we signed could be protested. If it was protested, I was the deciding judge. It was a quasi-judicial hearing. You would bring your client and say, well, I was lowest, and yet you didn't give me the bid. I want to know why. And I'd have the hearing. Every retiree came before the retirement board. I'm in charge of it. And it was a legal question, mainly, whether they should be retired or It was great to have Frierson and great to have legal advice of Cliff and Cliff Pierce and Frierson Graves, but many of those things I could just do myself. I didn't need to have their opinions on a lot of things. I notice even now, you have certain rigorous rules down there at City Hall when I'm mediating that the city attorney can do this much, and the mayor has to do that much, and then the council has to do that much, and the same way in the county. And I was able to cut through that pretty much, and if I decided that was okay, that was the end of it. I think it's a real positive attribute to be a lawyer, to have some legal training, and if you're involved in government at any level. I know everybody wants to shoot all the lawyers, and I know that this is a time that lawyers have come into disrepute. Well, I'm going to tell you, as far as I'm concerned, we have in this particular bar has found a group of men and women in the law that I've ever known. Now, I'm not sure that the whole bar is as high quality as it was. Maybe I'm old core and new core. Maybe it's old school and new school. But I somehow, when the people that dealt with my father and the people that were his age, the Kennedys, Walter Armstrongs, the Lucius Birches, and those kinds of people, those kinds of men who took such an active part, not only in the law, but in the judiciary and in the mechanics of the community, all for trying for the welfare. It just doesn't seem to me we have the same. Maybe we just have too many. I mean, we just have so many now that each one's running around with it, just grabbing for the piece of the pie. We have these ads that start off little nice ads, see Chandler for legal problems, and now you got billboards out there saying, if you really want a fireworks, come to see Henry Jones or whatever. I'm just using that fictitious name. And it sickens me, I'll be honest with you. I think it is just absolutely demeaning. Now it's gotten to be who can get the biggest ad. Now those people are making a lot of money. Those ads people, they're in the front of the television programs, they're in the telephone book, they're in the newspapers, they're in the Sunday supplements. They get business that ought to be going to more qualified people. I just think the advertising was a big mistake. I say mistake. I mean, it's a federal decision said that was you can do that, but it has. I think it's damaged the general quality of lawyers. I also think we do get an awful lot of lawyers, maybe in Memphis because of colleges. And I think that makes the competition worse. I think it makes the feelings between lawyers grow more combative. I hear words said like lie, or you know that's not true, or something. When I was on the bench that I never even remotely heard, except maybe one time. I did hear a lawyer one time say to Manir, now you made that statement and that's not true and you know it. And nothing was said until we got out in the hall. Manir knocked the guy about 30 feet across the hall. I won't mention his name, but knocked him right to his knees. And he said, now, I'm going to tell you one more time, that was a true statement. These days, you don't have that, but you also have a lot of loose tongues, and the respect between lawyers is not as great. I don't think the meetings between people, for example, this is a great firm here. I mean, outstanding lawyers and outstanding young lawyers. Now, whether they're getting to meet other young lawyers who are of their kind, of their ilk that they're going to be dealing with on a social plane or on any kind of plane, I don't know. If they didn't know them in law school, but they should be. You know a lot of the lawyers your age in all the big firms, all the people that are doing their work. And so if you think something's amiss in the law, you've got a ready call can be made to your network. A lot of these young lawyers, they just don't have that. They don't. They go to their parties, I guess, and that's about it for the year. They've had their deal for the year. And your senior partner here, Brother Thomason, organized, a group that met on a regular basis when we first started to discuss the law, went through the code, as a matter of fact. It seems idiotic now. But we learned a lot, and we learned some close associations that have lasted my lifetime.
Judge, some of those views, I'm sure, came from your being on the bench. And after 11 years as a mayor, you actually resigned from being the mayor to take a position with the Circuit Court of Shelby County. Tell us about that. Tell us why you wanted to do it and
first
how you
of all,
got there.
I'm kind of a term limit man. I think that you get into office, you take this job here, now, that's 11 years is a long time. We're going to have one soon, Brother Harrington. But there are not many that have served that long, Overton and maybe one or two others. It certainly wasn't going to be my lifetime. I knew I wasn't going to be able to stay in that the rest of my life. My new ideas I had all pretty much put into effect. Things like, unhappily, maybe the fact that you now have to push your garbage out to the street rather than have it picked up in the back. But if you can just consider the workers' comp cases that were given up, the dog bite cases, the accusations against the garbage people for stealing out of the backyard, etc. And the fact that we now have 2 people doing the work, what it took 6 before, you can see that 19 million or whatever it is a year is worth it. But that's the type of thing. We had done those things. We had changed the financial makeup completely of the city and become a model for the country. We had done our airport renovation. We had expanded the zoo and Art Academy and Brooks and Pink Palace and things that I felt needed to be done. And I mean, I could stay down there, and it was enjoyable riding around in a big old limo, and have a siren and a blue light that I could turn on and kind of, wave at folks, kind of give them that high sign. But I was ready to get back to the law. As a matter of fact, doing my strike, and rather than the first strike in '78 when I had my strike, I was thrown, of course, into the court system again because I was now a defendant or a plaintiff or whatever I was, trying to enjoin the fireman and the policeman. And I walked through the old law library and the old smell of the books, you know what I mean? Kind of brings you back. What am I doing over here when this is where I belong? And I could either come back, ask somebody on bended knee for a job practicing law to kind of restart, or I could do what I kind of thought about doing, as I mentioned earlier, years before, and that is take a crack at the judiciary. I think a lot of people were shaken by that. What in the world is Chandler doing, coming back, going on the bench? I mean, it kind of looked like he won't know what's going on. But I had been in the courts a lot, and I knew what went on, and I had, I think, a good temperament and a good ability to work with people to try to come to the right conclusion. And I think I have a reasonably quick mind that I could pick up on what new things, and a lot of new things that have come about. And so I said, well, I'll give it a try. I wanted and did call Don Southern, who was the head of the bar, and told him, I want your group to sit down. If they say they don't want me back here, I'm not going to come and try to run roughshod. They apparently had a meeting. He wrote the governor and told him that they felt that I could do a good job, and I was the end of it. And I worked hard. I got some recognition. I was, as you know, the junior bar selected me as the judge of the year one year, and then of course at the end when they gave some power to the person that was the, I guess I don't know whether it's senior judge or presiding judge, some kind of judge, the head judge of the whole county. I was the first one that held that for 2 years, and enjoyed that. So I guess that all in all, I feel good about my service. I enjoyed every minute of it. I enjoyed the association, and that's why I'm doing this mediation. As you know, in mediation, you're dealing primarily, almost exclusively, with trial lawyers. You're dealing with what I consider lawyers. I know it's lawyers if you represent the bank and the trust department and all. Not to me. I mean, I don't think unless you go in there and get your hands dirty and get the hell beat out of you now and then, you're not a lawyer. You know, it's okay to draw deeds all day if you like that. But to be a lawyer is a guy at the English bar that had the wig on and got up and solicitor.
Yeah, you like the barrister.
I like
system.
the barristers. It's going out, as you know. I know you've talked about your men over there, and they're getting away from the barrister. And I love the idea that barristers had their deal raised up. You know, they put their books and their papers raised up on a platform so that, you know, they weren't like the rest of them, had them down on the table. And, of course, that's, to me, a remarkable system, but apparently it's about to end.
Judge, you'd been away from from practicing law for a number of years, and now you're a judge. What did you do to get yourself up to speed?
Well,
Or did you have to?
I think it's put like this. George Brown said there wasn't much foreplay when he went on the bench. I went in the first day and went into a jury trial and just winged it. I mean, I had sat down for a night with McPherson, and I had gotten a long list of charges given to me by the young lady that went over to the federal court. She was still there.
Helen.
Who?
Helen.
No, the woman that's on with the federal court now.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Judge Gibbons, Julia Gibbons. She came and brought me a bunch of charges, and I said, "Well, thank you," you know.
And she was a judge at
she
the
was
time
a judge
herself.
on the circuit court bench at that time.
And you mentioned Judge McPherson.
Judge McPherson as well, who had worked hard during my campaigns with me. He had been one of my handshaking bunches, went all through all these buildings, and wonderful guy. And they primarily got me kind of in tune, and of course for the first, I guess, 2 or 3 weeks or month, I talked to others about particular matters that would arise that were different. But then I was ready to hold my own, I guess, and I felt that I was able to. As you know, we now have, maybe sad to say it, but we have some folks down there that came on the bench without any experience, really had never even been in the circuit court, and they will, in my opinion, be very difficult for them ever to catch up, because there's a feel a practitioner has about that court that is different. You can't learn it in school. You can't learn. You have to be in there. You have to rise up and say, "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Wyeth Chandler, and I'm here to represent Al Harvey." You have to do that, and do it often to get the feel of what's demanded of being in that particular court.
Did you have any reluctance about going to the other judges and asking them for assistance or getting their thinking on issues?
Absolutely not. And I think that amazed them. You know, they thought, "Well, you know, he's going to come over here and know everything, and over there at the mayor's office, whatever, blah, blah, blah." That's not me, and I put myself in their hands as soon as I could. I'm glad to do it. And they were kind of glad, I think, to help me in every way they could, and they did help me.
The judges had at the time, I guess, a lunch group, didn't they?
They did. They had a lunch group which phased itself out. You know, the old, as I mentioned, the old group, the 5, when they had 5 and then 6 and then 7, they were all middle-aged white males, and they would meet at the Catholic Club or wherever for their little luncheon. And of course, they also, as a result of their conversations, kept the circuit court on an even keel. By that I mean there wasn't one decision being made in this court that was totally at variance with one being made in the other court. They looked on it as what it is. It's one court. There are just 9 divisions of that court. And it wasn't long after this new group had come in that we were soon advised that this isn't going to be one court. If I want to start my court at 6 in the morning, I'll do it. If I want to stay till 10 at night, I'll do it. If I don't want to come in at 10, that's my business. And we don't want to hear anything about it. And it shook me. I didn't like that. I liked the idea that we would coordinate our work and have one court so that you'd have the same jury selection process, for example, in my court that you did in number 2. But I'm afraid that's all changed.
Judge, there was Shelby County got a lot of credit, I think, because of its what they used to call the transfer system. And I know you participated in that, and as a matter of fact, had the reputation that you would never shrug a case. If you were open, you'd take the case.
Except from one division. except from one division. I won't go into it except to say that that particular division sent me a case. It was a difficult case, a hard case, had 12 lawyers or whatever. And they all came in. It took me about 3 weeks to try it, hard, and so forth. The day after I had been given the case, which you take, you know, when they're busy, that particular judge was on national television attending another trial. I won't mention what trial, and that was more than I could bear. So I just had my share, skip that particular court. But I did send out for the rest of them. I like to try cases. I enjoyed every case, and especially the cases that you're involved in, because in the malpractice and in big death cases and cases of that, you have the best lawyers. You don't get a lot of junk. You get objections when there should be objections. You don't get objections just to make objections. I don't know how many times I was down there when I'd say to somebody, "Do you really want to make that objection, Mr. Jones? That seems to be favorable to you." You know, somebody'd say, "Well, my mother-in-law said they were speeding 50 miles an hour," but it'd be the other guy, and this guy'd rise up to object. He knew that was wrong somehow, and we had some of that down there.
Judge, of course, a circuit judge is always subject to be to have his decisions reversed in the Court of Appeals. Does that ever happen to you?
It happened to me many times, quite a few times, not maybe more than the average. I don't know what the average runs. I tell you, the one problem I did have on that one issue was I guess I would have been reversed even more on the moving of children from this jurisdiction by their mothers. I guess I had 3 out of all, but I had maybe 12, 15. I've got all my cases stacked up somewhere. And of course, you can flip them up through the different computer things. But that was one issue that I still think I'm right on, and will always, I guess, think I'm right on. That when a man and a woman get a divorce and they agree, for example, that the woman will have custody, but that he'll have visitation regularly and so forth, and that for her, for no reason whatever, but just I decide to move to Georgia or to Paris, France, and just could walk out and take that child away. And these people on the Court of Appeals would say, "Well, we'll give them extra visitation in the summer," as if that'll make up for the fact that the son is now, 16 years old, living in Seattle. He isn't going to come home. He's got his girlfriend. His activities are out in Seattle, and you'd have to drag him. And if you do, he'll hate having been drugged. So I think they got me about 3 times on that, because I never would toe the line. I'd try to find a way around it to keep them from going. But other than that, generally speaking, I had good results. I enjoyed. I had one judge up there that not from this firm by any means. He was one of my favorites, but I had one judge up there I had a little problem with. Other than that, good results.
Judge, I want to ask you some questions now about. You've already talked about some of these things, but you have so much experience and you've seen lawyers in so many different ways. I wanted to go back to one of your comments about the degree of civility or professional conduct that you witnessed as a judge, particularly in the later years of your judicial service. Could you comment on that for us? Because I know it's gotten a lot of publicity.
Well, as you know, there's been intemperance between lawyers, I think, not only outside of the courtroom, but inside the courtroom. Obviously, these things that make headlines when a lawyer says to a fellow, "I hope that you get tried or your wife gets tried one of these days and does this and that." I know that fella. He's recanted and hopefully is doing fine and over it. You can get carried away, but that's what's happened because of the tremendously competitive nature now. It seems like it's always been a competitive. It's always been a battle between Class A people. But now it's like politics in a way. It's more mudslinging than ever to me. There's every kind of innuendo you can make, and I don't tolerate it. Never did tolerate it. I had lawyers accuse me of things that were ridiculous. Like I was, in one case, was appealed by a lawyer here because he said that I had gone into the jury room and talked to the jury. Well, I had. I mean, there was no question about it. I walked in front of him and his opponent, and I said, "Ladies and gentlemen, y'all ready to go to lunch?" And they said, "Yeah, we." I said, "You know, can't reach a verdict, you don't think, before lunch?" "No, we need to go to lunch." I said, "Fine." Walked out, said they want to go to lunch. Is that okay? Yep. And they went. Now, they appealed me then on the grounds that I went in there. I mean, they brought in the jurors, and all the jurors said, he said, "Do you want to go to lunch?" And what I told him. Now, that to me is just a little step beyond. I mean, if there's any that didn't change anything, as a matter of fact, in that particular case, that lawyer's witness, who witnessed an accident down in Whitehaven, was shown to have been at that very time at work in Frazier. In other words, he was supposed to have been in South Memphis watching an accident. He was actually at work in North Memphis. The arguments between the lawyers sometimes gets much grimmer. We've had, as you know, guns now carried into a particular courtroom. We've had lawyers tell absolute blatant lies, make threats. It's not the usual. Don't let me get you the idea that it's just a bunch of madmen down there. They're not. Most of the trial lawyers in this city conduct themselves very well. But I get the idea that even between the conversations on the phone are snappish. They're not necessarily conducted with the respect that a good lawyer should give another lawyer. People talk bad about lawyers, I think, now, more than they ever have. They'll mention so-and-so, this and that. It's a strain on a lot of lawyers. I think they're under a lot more strain with all the costs. I think a lot of them, because of this dollar and hourly deal, have had, I don't know about young lawyers up here, for example, but I know there's some young lawyers that I feel, you've got to get so many hours. And that puts a strain on them and makes them act like they wouldn't act ordinarily. I'm not sure how strong ethics is being taught in colleges. I mean, I think these lawyers that come out know a lot more law probably than you and I. Whether they know how to act as a gentleman or a gentlelady, or whether they had to know, try to slip a little something under the rug, or call somebody at home to solicit their business, tell them, I understand you were run over last night and I want to help you out. That's going on. And it's widely going on in this city right now, and nobody seems to have a handle on it, or a desire really to have a handle on it, because advertising is so big that what's a call, and they got blaring TV programs telling you, call me and I'll save you.
I want to ask you, Judge, to compare the attitude of lawyers toward you as a judge when you first went on the bench, as opposed to 14 years later when you left the bench, but we're going to do that when we come back.